Am I the only one? I asked myself this question for years. I thought I was weird because I'd never had an orgasm with a man. Or a woman. I tried both. Although I'd had them on my own on countless occasions. Grinding up against a Raggedy Andy doll in the lush, green safety of the branches of a tree that hugged the ground. My child body thrashed about in lust and release. And then, there were all those nights pressed hard against my pillow. It was almost an obsession, I did it so often, but afterwards, I always felt guilty, ashamed. Many a morning, I vowed never to do it again. But what was strange was that I was not a child of repressed parents preaching sin and degradation. An abandoned copy of Hustler was not my first exposure to the male member. I had seen all kinds of penises. Black ones, gay ones, puny ones, those odd ones that point down instead of up, wrinkled ones. In fact, a veritable rainbow of genitalia had paraded before my eyes before I was old enough to know what to do with mine. Skinny dipping, psychedelic potlucks, and the flaunting of convention wove the fabric of my tie-dyed childhood. I thought I knew it all. So when I had sex for the first time and didn't come, I was surprised. I didn't bleed either, supporting my suspicion that somewhere, somehow, someone had done me wrong. I had no memory of it then, and to this day I still don't. Barring intense bouts of hypnotherapy, I may never know. Maybe it was all that tree climbing. But I had expected that I would thrill to sex, that it would have affected me the same way that Raggedy Andy had. But aside from shedding a few tears over the fact that I would now never see a unicorn, my first entry into the great world of physical ecstasy was, well, rather perfunctory. And I had been a virgin for so long. I was known as the blue ball queen of Eugene. While everyone I knew was getting it on in all kinds of ways, I was very precisely saving myself. But time goes on, and soon as I was 19 and in a new city, and my virginity had become very boring. Along came the scruffy, deep-voiced, motorcycle-riding poet who offered to name a star after me. Perfect. One night he invited me over to see the Christmas lights in his apartment. Pistachios were eaten, a bottle of red wine was consumed, and in a moment of bravado I asked him to have sex with me. Eager and awkward, he rushed about preparing the scene. In went a tape of T-Rex, and out came the futon he kept rolled up against the wall. The whole thing was over in a few minutes. In the aftermath, he grinned, and I smoked hard to hide my disappointment. I wasn't impressed, but I was stunned by the sudden shifting of reality sex had created. I could now have sex at any time with anyone if I wanted to. That thought blew my mind. I ogled the hairy guy at the pizzeria with vastly different eyes. Wondered suddenly about the dumpy middle-aged couple that bought bagels from me, and listened avidly to the soaring sex fest of my upstairs neighbors. It shocked me how easy the whole thing was. You could just do it. Anyone could. I began to ask my friends for tips. What was it supposed to feel like? How did you give good head? They were all effusive in their explanations, colorful, and at times poetic. But what I missed then was that no one talked about the awkwardness, the moments of terror and disconnection. I didn't even know how to ask about that. So by the time I had moved to New York and had sex with a couple of different people, and it was all still really boring, I began to think that there was something wrong with me. I loved the kissing and the rolling around, but soon, the moment of penetration would rear its head, and all joy would cease abruptly. I began to fake it just so I could be done and go smoke on my fire escape. I became good at faking it, at giving head, and at convincing others I was a wild, wild girl. Demure, repressed, and resistant were dirty words in the crowd I rolled with. We were edgy and off the map, wearing the marks of our abdication from the status quo on our skins. I sipped tea in dominatrix dens, worked with bi-curious trannies, drank with lesbian strippers, and had a collection of whips on my wall. I delighted in everyone's exploration and still do now, but I had made a very serious mistake. I was wearing a costume that didn't fit. I wanted love and acceptance, and in its absence, I settled for attention. I couldn't talk to my partners about all of this confusion, since that would mean admitting my charade, confessing my shame. If only they could believe the myth, then perhaps I could too. But then the loneliness would loom vast and terrifying. And so I began going to bars by myself to write in a little book. It was just a prop, as were my cigarettes, to mask my desperation. Desperate for someone to talk to, be with, feel close to. On one of those nights, I met the Greek. He was tall, handsome, and if he'd been wearing a loose white shirt, he would have fulfilled many a romance novel fantasy. Instead, he was from Queens. For my sordid tale, it would have been much better to say that I just went home with him then and there. But my dormant virgin virtue made me insist he take me out first. So a few nights later, that's just what he did, but only for drinks. I foolishly thought I was interviewing him for possible boyfriend status, but when we ended up in the back of his car with this rather large cock in my hand, I realized that a relationship would not be the likely outcome of this transaction. I didn't really know why I was doing it. I was attracted to him and liked the smell of his wool coat, but I wasn't in the throes of desire. It just suddenly seemed terribly impolite to tell him to put it back in his pants. A week later, I couldn't even remember his name. Depression set in as I began to wonder what the fuck was it all about at the end of the day. Was it all just really about getting off? And since I wasn't, what was the point? I began to view sex as some sort of colossal evil joke. It screamed at me from every billboard, was the endless topic of conversation. It looked in the eyes and pelvises of men hissing at me on the street. It was everywhere, and yet it all seemed so terribly ridiculous. This sad state of affairs could have gone on until I had 40 cats and the kind of face that could cut glass. But luckily, I decided to move to England. And like every good American girl traipsing around ye old London town, I got a job at a pub. And at that pub was a young man with a bushy red beard and a thick Scottish accent, who would make me tea and play me songs. He also wore rainbow socks and talked like a marionette on acid. He was fun and odd, but decidedly only friend material. I would stay in his room on those nights when we closed the pub late and it was a long, cold bus ride back to Tottenham. I spent months cuddled up against his lovely furry body, keeping the chill and his interest at bay. But then one day, I watched him change a light bulb. And there he was, all stretched out on a ladder, lanky and lean. I took stock of the fine length of his hip, the strength of his back, the animal manliness of him, and suddenly what had been comforting suddenly became appealing. I pushed the thrill down. I was too used to disappointment and enjoyed his company too much to ruin it with my bad history. But a few days later, perhaps responding to the dog whistle of my desire, he asked me out on a date. We had dinner at a small Italian joint and I invited him to stay over. Quid pro quo, you know. I was almost asleep when he kissed me. And then he pulled me closer and gently slid his fingers down under my graceless sweatpants. I was about to pull his hand away, but then, oh goodness, he was such an expert that all thoughts in my head dissolved. He made me come in 5 minutes flat. I was awed. When it was over, he cuddled up and fell asleep. Again, I was stunned. Didn't he want something? Wasn't I expected to return the favor? Nope. He was happy as pie to snore in my ear. By a strange stroke of fortune, I had attracted one of those rare men who enjoy opening up sexually dysfunctional women. It was his true calling, he admitted later. Well, that, and being a puppeteer. So at last my awakening had begun. He gave and gave until he discovered I could really enjoy giving to him. So tender was he that little by little, that man had me moaning and shouting orgasmic amens all over the place. And I finally got what it was all about. Sex was awesome, transcendent even, and one of the greatest things about being human. He and I had a few good months. We whiled away the days drinking brandy, singing blues tunes, and staying in bed till 3. We even shared a cold, cold January in Glasgow, where only rampant frolicking could make us forget the icicles on the pillow. But true love was not to be. We were both meant for different things. I like fancy shoes, and he hates bars or dress codes. So after an affectionate parting, he followed a circus to Ireland, and I moved to San Francisco. Many amorous adventures have occurred since, but I will always be grateful to that man who gave me his selflessness. He taught me that I had been doing something wrong all of those years. I have believed that I didn't matter.